So Kane is one of the veterans of this field, and he's wearing the right color for my metaphor. I called him last year one of the lions of conversational AI, because you had this very nice lion presentation at the last Cognigy Summit. So I'm really looking forward to your presentation. He's always giving a great show, and floor is yours, Kane. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Appreciate that. Is there a clicker thing around here somewhere? Yeah, have you got a clicker? Here it is. Sorted. Problem solved. Thank you, Christoph. How's it going? All right? Yeah? Any sore heads this morning? One, yeah. Who was at the drinks last night? A few people? I thought there would have been a few more. Judging by the bill, you obviously drink a lot. Thank you. I think, what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about this. So, Christoph, you mentioned earlier about, we've kind of been doing this stuff for quite a while now. And what we were learning in 2017 and 2018, when we were building Alexa skills and the not necessarily the first, but I suppose the more contemporary version of voice IVRs and stuff like that, we were kind of building on top of some of the best practices that was learned from, the early companies that were doing this, Nuance, and all the people that were at Nuance and those type of companies, the Kathy Pearls and the John Blooms and Daniel Padgett's. And we were really fortunate because those people were all at Amazon and at Google, and they were building the next generation of these kind of natural language-based interfaces. And so during that time, we were fortunate enough to be able to build on top of that learning. And as the technology changes and improved, we kind of established new sort of standards and principles and things like that. And what was, at the time, painful for those people, the Kathy Pearls of the world, was that we've already fixed some of these problems, but all of the people who are coming into the Alexa skill world are now facing them for the first time and almost not really sure how to solve them. And I feel like we're a little bit in that phase now, where the companies that are approaching conversational AI and natural language processing, they are coming into it, and the people coming into it perhaps for the first time, building natural language interfaces for the first time, and it's almost like we've got a bit of amnesia, which is that we've kind of forgotten some of the best practices that still apply today, and it feels very tech-led as opposed to user-led. The guy from Nebly there is talking about, they want to measure customer experience, and I think where we seem to be as an industry, I saw a post on LinkedIn from somebody at, might have been IBM, wasn't the speaker that was here from IBM yesterday, but it was saying something like, AI is 5% AI and 100% engineering. And I kind of read that and I was thinking, so 0% design. We don't have any concerns about the end user in any of this situation. And so you see companies like Salesforce, and they announce Agentforce, and it's the power of the technology I don't think can be underestimated. I think we're probably overestimating, it's the old adage, you overestimate something in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. I think we're overestimating it right now. And you see Salesforce, they'll launch Agentforce, and it's all you've got to do is just type a few sentences about what you want this thing to do, press a button, and it'll just go and solve all the problems for you. And then 2 weeks ago, you see Agentforce have launched version 2 of Agentforce, which is now you can have deterministic workflows and you can capture variables from a conversation. And it's well, welcome to 2018. So it's kind of I feel as though we're a little bit tech-centric at the moment. And so what I wanted to sort of do is to share with you some of the principles that we learned over the last 8 years that still apply today, that you can use to make generative AI applications and experiences better for the people that use them, or that need to use them. This is Jacob Nielsen. He essentially is does everyone know Jacob Nielsen? Yeah, absolute legend, godfather of user experience design. He was on our podcast, the VUX World podcast recently, and such an interesting episode. I would definitely recommend check it out. And he was kind of complaining that AI systems have been completely ignoring all of the practices that he's been advocating for and helped to create in user experience design over the last 45 years. And I couldn't agree more with that. And so last summer, maybe it's before, we kind of created these AI design principles. We didn't create them. These are a synthesis of essentially everything we've learned through the consulting practice and working with clients and putting this kind of stuff into practice, everything we've learned through the 350 odd podcasts that we've had with industry leaders and practitioners and all that kind of stuff. And so we kind of like spent some time trying to distill down, like, what is the recipe for success to be able to do this kind of stuff properly. And these kind of principles, if you go to the website, vox.world/principles, there's a bit more behind that, and there's standards that underpin each one of these, which is, what is the kind of recipe for success to be able to design front-end experiences that are successful and work well for users, to be able to create the technology infrastructure and functionality that works proficiently and properly, and then also the teams and processes that are required in order to do this and the strategy required. And so this kind of incorporates a whole kind of load of that. And the reason why I called this the full stop problem with RAG is that this isn't a kind of dig at RAG as a concept, because there's many different types of RAG and it can be applied in many different areas and many different situations. But the applications that have been going to production recently in the last kind of 18 months have been kind of like RAG chatbots that pretty much just do RAG. I won't name any names, but there's been a number of companies that have launched these kind of things, and they solve some problems that NLU systems struggled with, which is that they tend to have a response for pretty much everything, which is great, but they have some fundamental limitations, which is that RAG systems are just retrieving information and giving you the results. They don't fundamentally understand what a conversation is or what the goals of the interaction are, and they don't really do a job at helping solve user problems. They just leave users ask question after question. And so there's a few things in here that I thought we'd kind of run through some of these principles and show you some examples of how RAG systems, if you are to use them as the front end of your chatbot, tend to work, and how you might be able to improve them. So the one thing around retrieval augmented generation systems that they on their own don't do particularly well is they fail to differentiate between a question and an action. So for a user, for example, if they say something like, I'm moving house and I need to update my address, they're telling you that they need to perform some kind of action. But a retrieval augmented generation system, if you were to just use it as most use it to the front end of your chatbot, it will treat that like a question, and it will answer it like a question. So it'll say, you can update your address in the mobile app or using our website or whatever it might be. And it'll end in a full stop. And this is why I call it the full stop problem, because it doesn't understand the nature of conversation. It doesn't understand what a turn is. Now, the principle of a turn in a conversation is that you really should be inviting the user to take the next turn, and it should be going somewhere towards helping the user achieve their goal. So it's not necessarily human-centered, if you wanted to draw it back to the principles, because it's not really understanding what the actual need is here and trying to help solve the need. It's just searching for a response, gathering some data, and then pushing the data back again. So a more effective use of that might be, if I want to move house, it's not a problem, let's just authenticate you and we can get on with it. Now, obviously, that's predicated on you having the functionality to be able to do that in your chatbot. Maybe you don't, but at least you might want to point them in the right direction, give them a link to where they can actually go ahead and do that, or actually get them towards some kind of outcome. So it means that you need to have something really before the RAG that's able to then differentiate between, is this a question, is this a service, is this something else? And I've called it a classifier. I don't mean machine learning classifier in this instance, although that is being used in many instances where they've got an NLU model first of all, and then things that fall out of that go to a RAG. You could actually use RAG as a classifier. I mean, VoiceFlow recently have killed their NLU. They're using RAG as a classifier. And within that RAG, they've got kind of like a way of being able to sort of differentiate between information and services based on provided links or whatever. But essentially, you need to have something, and that could be an agent of some description. It could be an LLM that's working this out, and one of the tools it has access to might be a RAG sort of database or what have you. But needless to say, RAG on its own, doing its own thing, is always just going to retrieve and respond, and it's not going to understand what the conversation is. The next side of things is that it fails, if you just implement it as it is, it fails to understand subtext. So if a user says something like, how do I upgrade my phone contract? This is a real example from a telco in the UK. It will say something like, to upgrade your contract, all you've got to do is find out how long's left on your contract and go ahead and upgrade or whatever. You might think that's the same issue as before, but before the user was telling you specifically, I want to update my address. They knew what they wanted and they were going ahead and doing it. In this instance, the user doesn't necessarily know that they want to update their contract, but that's the subtext of the question. And so it's not really goal-oriented. You've answered the question, of course, but there's a deeper need behind that you need to be able to deal with. So you need to start getting users towards their goals. So even if you answer that question, which you may do, you still might want to then say, let's kind of progress you. Should we get you logged in? Should we say how long's left on your contract? Because that's a sales-based conversation as well. The stage of the user journey is retention. And so that's something that, you might want to sort of treat that slightly differently. And so you need to have some degree of kind of like either state management or some relationship between your content and your services in this instance, which is where I think the concept of sort of like knowledge graphs and ontologies starts to become very interesting here. So if you can have relationships between different types of content and relationships between different service offerings that you have, you can start to be a bit more sensible about when you start to present, not necessarily, I don't want to call it an upsell, but when do you start to present, we can solve this for you, rather than we can just keep answering questions. They don't all also have an awareness of the stage of the customer journey. So in that instance I just gave there was that the user is in a kind of like coming to the end of their contract. It could potentially be a cancellation conversation, or it could be a retention conversation, it could be a sales conversation. And so typically if I say something like, can I add another person to my insurance? It'll say, yes, you can, as long as they meet certain requirements. How long will it take? Blah, blah, blah. What it kind of does is most RAG systems, because of this full stop problem where they end in a full stop, they put the onus on the user all the time. So by ending in a full stop and not inviting the next turn, it's up to me to decide what my next question is going to be and me to drive the conversation forward. That's not really an engaging way for a system to behave or for an agent to behave if you're putting the onus on the user all the time to think about what they might need next. What we ought to be able to do is to be able to, over time, establish where the customer is in their journey, what their interest is, and then for the conversation to become, rather than user-led, which is up to me to decide what I want, to assistant-led or agent-led, which is I know what you need now. You might not know this specifically yourself, but I've figured out what you need, and now I'm going to take control and start to direct the conversation. So those systems, fundamentally, they're not really easy to use. I mean, they might appear to be easy to use because they use natural language, and natural language is easier to use than figuring out where you need to click and do things with. So they have the veneer of usability and ease of use, but actually we're putting the onus on the user all the time to figure out what it is that I need and to be able to phrase my question properly, whereas we could take control of that and do something more like this, which is you can do that as long as it meets certain conditions. How long will it take? So they've asked a few questions, and we might finish that with, would you like to do that now? This is a good example for like a sales-based conversation. If you've got a customer and they're asking a few questions about the vehicles that you sell or what have you, how many times are you going to keep them going around the houses of asking question after question after question before you say, are you interested in speaking to someone about booking a test drive? Do you want to start getting into a place where we can start to customize the vehicle for you or what have you? You need to be able to take them closer towards their goal. And so now we're in a situation where ideally we want to understand what stage of the customer journey we're at and what type of conversations we're having so that we can start to be more useful. And so here again, you've got kind of like, let's say you've got content that's related to services that are in your awareness phase. Someone's just on your website, they're kicking the tires, they're doing a bit of research. We need to be able to understand when the right time is to start taking control of that conversation to get them further down the funnel. It doesn't do things like conditional questioning very well. So if I say something like, can I add my grandma to my insurance? This is the real example as well. Can I add my grandma to my insurance policy? The chatbot might say, adding your grandma to the insurance policy is likely feasible if she lives in your household, has access to the listed vehicles and drives them regularly. You can submit a request by doing this. There's a whole bunch of things wrong with that, but the main thing that's wrong with it is it sounds plausible and it sounds like a good answer. And so if you were testing this, if a developer was testing this, they'd probably get that response and they'd be thinking, that's not bad now, he's done his job there. The massive problem with this is that it has the word likely in it. It's likely feasible. Well, is it feasible or is it not? So it doesn't solve. It doesn't follow the holistic principle because it doesn't solve a full problem. It doesn't actually. In fact, it doesn't follow the Grice's cooperative principle either because it's full of ambiguity. So what you want to be able to do in that situation is, if there's conditions that need to be met in order to provide an answer, you need to be able to break down that request in order to gather more information to figure out what the actual right answer is. So it's more appropriate to do something like, can I add my grandma to an insurance policy? Well, probably, but it depends. Does she live in the same house as you? Well, yes, she does. And does she have a valid driving license? Well, yes, she does. And then maybe we can actually answer the question that's not ambiguous, no room for ambiguity. We can actually answer the proper question. And RAG, it's not the problem with RAG necessarily, because you can probably have RAG solutions that do this. It's just that the way that they're implemented at this moment in time is just essentially search in a chatbot. If you want search in a chatbot, why do you need the chatbot? A chatbot surely inherently is there to chat, which means it has to have an understanding of what a conversation is, and therefore it needs to be able to use the hallmarks of conversation to make the whole thing easier to use, rather than be in search. Because if all it is search, you may as well just use search. There's no need for a chatbot. Get rid of the widget in that bottom right-hand corner and put the RAG behind your search, which many are actually doing, and it's pretty effective. And so that's really it, really. I mean, I don't have anything more than that. I just wanted to sort of like, essentially the point that I'm trying to make, which I could have probably made in 30 seconds, is to say, it's great to be concerned about the technology, and it's brilliant that the technology is moving at such a pace that it is really exciting. But what I think the observations that I've had over the last sort of like 18 months or so is that it's technology that's leading everything. And it's the decisions that are being made are around, can we physically make this happen? Is it achievable? Is it feasible? And which you need. The whole concept of 5% AI, 100% engineer, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with the importance of engineering, because all of this stuff doesn't happen without it. It's absolutely fundamental and crucial. What we need to include into that mix is the design element, the user-centric element. In 2021, when I was here talking on the other stage in the other room, I was talking about how like NLU systems are inherently at the time being kind of used in a tech-centric manner. And what it meant was that the experiences were terrible because the whole thing was seen as a technology problem. And we're kind of back at that same situation. So, and it's always been like that in web, in mobile. It's always been the case that because the technology's there, it's seen as a technology problem and the design function comes later. But if you look at every successful organization, most of them have some kind of user-centric culture, some kind of design-led culture. And if you think about, like, what is it? I think it was Steve Jobs, the classic kind of Steve Jobs phrase, which is start with the user experience and work back to the technology. So if you understand the principles that are required to create great user experiences, which requires the design function, you can then work back through the engineering and technology to create the experiences that you want, rather than making something that functionally works, essentially. And so that's it, really. If you're interested in listening to the podcast, VUX World on all podcast players, you can do that. And definitely check out the one with Jacob Nielsen. It's really good. The AI Ultimatum is our Substack newsletter. Every week or so, we've got some really, really great insights coming through that. There's a maturity assessment in there if you want to kind of see where you sit on our kind of 5-6-step maturity scale. And connect with me on LinkedIn if you so desire. We'll be outside for the rest of the day. And, yeah, enjoy yourself. Thank you.
Stay with me, because we might have time for 1 or 2 questions. I just want to point out, this was a user-centric presentation. You didn't see any company logo on there, like except for VUX, which is fine. This is your own company. But this was about you. You don't care, like they work with great companies, but you don't care about the logos of these companies. You want to take something away, and you did a great job taking you through some pain points, and that's the value of design. You know, this is a belief that we both of us share, and I think this was a really, really great presentation. And the point is, like, I want to make two points before I go to questions. You know, if you talk to people about AI and they never ask you a question about data, they're not AI experts. It's the quickest check that you can do. Second point is, if they never ask you a question about your users and their problems, they don't care about you, they just care about themselves. There's a nice sentence which is saying, like, not every solution has a problem. So, you know, don't start with the solution, start with the problem. That was very nice. So we have time for, I think, 1 or 2 questions before we move to, yeah, we do. Let me just start here and then.
First off, those are some really good examples that you walk through, you know, about how you put the customer first and try to have a natural conversation. What are some of your thoughts around scenarios where you may have double intents? You know, someone might be calling and saying, you know, I want to add someone to my insurance policy, but I'm having problems logging in. What are some of the design considerations there, or technical limitations, or technical considerations?
Yeah, so Double intent was always tricky in the NLU world because it took a lot of kind of manual handling, but I think the principles is the same, is that any person can only concentrate on one thing at a time anyway, so you've got to break it down into two separate problems and solve the problems sequentially, essentially. And the principles that we're kind of going through here remain the same regardless, because all you're doing there is you're taking that one kind of request, breaking it down, and then fulfilling, you know, both kind of parts. And the concept around sort of like designing what the experience ought to be like, and, you know, what a good experience looks like is no different, really. The technology obviously will change in that respect. You know, I was having a conversation, I can't remember who it was, with yesterday around, you know, using the LLMs to do that is a great use case. You know, it can understand whether something's a multi-intent or what have you. It can manage context and all that sort of stuff. But these principles will apply fundamentally anyway, because the way in which it's being resolved is still through dialogue, is still through conversation. You know.
Hi, Kane. I'm Paul.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. Thought that was very interesting. I just have a question which is more a little bit more focused on sort of compliance areas. So I'm based in Brussels, so I deal a lot with data privacy legislation, AI legislation. So I'm just wondering, from your perspective in the field, what do you think of the AI Act, and do you think that could be an impediment to innovation for the industry as a whole? And, you know, do you advise, I mean, I don't know if you're doing consulting or anything of that nature, but do you advise organizations to try and look at some sort of layered privacy and or layered AI compliance within their applications?
Yeah, obviously there's the obvious things around kind of like what models you're using and where they're hosted and where the data's going, all this kind of stuff. I think from the AI Act, it's two-fold, I suppose. There's a lot of stuff in there about the foundation model providers themselves, and a lot of requirements of those model providers in terms of, like, you know, where's the data coming from and how biased is it or otherwise, and how are they kind of making sure that they're being, you know, they've got integrity in terms of the foundation models. For the company, I mean, I don't necessarily think that anything necessarily changes from a security standpoint, because if you want to put any technology into a large organization, there's certain things that you're going to have to do and certain processes you're going to follow. We were talking last night about a company in America where, you know, they didn't want any data leaving the organization whatsoever, and so there's servers and GPUs and all kinds of stuff being installed in this organization so they can run everything kind of locally, you know. I think that, will it stifle innovation? Regulation too early tends to do that, you know, but to be quite honest, from a company perspective, if I was, you know, Telefonica or whoever, the technology that exists now is good enough to make a very large impact. You can use it in secure ways, you know, either, you know, for OpenAI through Azure, or, you know, you can have your own kind of open source models hosted, you know, in your own kind of environment. I think there's enough technology capabilities now to be able to have a really kind of big impact. And so the kind of, I think the security concerns that the enterprise would have anyway, you know, you should be following those anyway, basically, you know. I think the regulation stuff, I think, will be more impactful in terms of stifling innovation from the model providers themselves, if anything.
Okay, so now we're going to have a small design challenge. So we have one more question. 1 minute for asking the question, answering the question. Then I'm using Caroline's bell, okay? All right. So I'm going to stop this. 1 minute design challenge.
Okay,
Cool.
thanks, Kate. Really good presentation. This is on. Hello? Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Involved design as well as engineering. That absolutely matches our experience. Have you got any tips for how and when to kind of bring design into the process?
40 seconds. How and when to bring design into the process supposes that the design isn't involved in the process at all, if you like, because you're going to have to find them and bring them in. I would say that at the beginning of the project, when defining who you need to do these things, I think that kind of team needs to be a mixture of skill sets. You can't do it without engineers and technical people, but I don't think you can do it without designers either, because the designer is not just the person that makes the words look nice. They're the people that go and find out what the problem is that we should be solving, what kind of solution ought to be meeting the needs of the users and all that kind of, not just the end user, but all of the users around the whole sort of solution. So I would say from the very, very beginning, you've got to have a mixture of design and technical people from the start.
Perfect solution of this design challenge, no? Like, that was a very, very nice answer. Thank you very much, Kane.
Thank you, appreciate it.